Hello, everybody. I think we'll start. You're very welcome to today's storytelling for children event with Galway Theatre Festival. I'm going to do a very brief introduction to our two wonderful storytellers, and then we'll start. So today we're joined by Hannah Brailsford. Hannah is a professional storyteller based in Essex, and Hannah tells stories, traditional and modern tales to young and old alike. Hannah runs Tiny Tales Storytellers for children, schools and families, and we're delighted that Hannah's here with us. We're also joined by Galway's own Orla McGovern, a storyteller, performer, writer based in Galway but travels the world telling her tales. Orla is also artistic director of Moth and Butterfly, which takes place in Galway and over the past number of months online every month. So I'm delighted that you're all here. For those of you watching, we are recording this, but as it's a webinar, you won't be seen, so no need to worry. All you'll see is the lovely faces of our two storytellers. So I'm going to start by handing over to Hannah. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's so lovely to be here, and I would love to be there in person with you. It would be so wonderful to be in Galway right now, but at least I can be with you over Zoom. So welcome. And May blessings to you. It's the 1st of May. And because it's the 1st of May, it's a time when fairies are abound. Fairies have woken up, because spring is well and truly sprung and summer is on its way. So I thought I would share a few little favourite tales about the fairy folk. And I'll let you into a secret. In my garden here in Essex, I have fairies that live at the bottom of my garden, underneath my maple tree. And this is a story that they told me. Once upon a time, on a beautiful spring day, the 1st of May, the skies were blue, the sun was shining, there were just little fluffy white clouds in the sky. And suddenly, behind one of those clouds, there appeared something strange. Now, some who had been looking up at the sky that morning, they thought that perhaps it was a bird, because birds, after all, fly in the sky. It was certainly an odd-looking bird, but they just brushed that and said, the birds are here to welcome May. But others, when they looked, they saw something quite different. And so the talk began. What was it that was flying around in the sky on this beautiful May day? Well, it didn't stay in the sky for long. That little tiny hat, for it was indeed a hat, came whizzing down from the clouds, down, down, down to the earth below, to the village and to the woods that were surrounding that village. And it flew between the trees of the wood until it came to a young boy who had been up early. He had been taking his dog for a walk in the woods, and he'd sat down on a log when that tiny little hat found him and sat upon his head. And when it did, the boy on the log suddenly turned into a frog. Well, before the boy could croak and say, "Stop!" the hat was off Off again, flying fast and free, through the trees, out of the trees, and into the fields beyond. Into the fields where there was a beautiful lady who had decided that on this wonderful spring day that she would take an early morning walk. A beautiful lady dressed all in yellow. And the hat flew fast and free towards her, and before she could blink, it had landed on her head and had turned her, that beautiful lady, into a bumblebee. And before she could buzz and protest, the hat was off again, darting this way and that. And if you'd been close to the hat, you would have heard a little giggle, for the hat was having a wonderful time, and it flew away from the fields towards the village. And as it flew into the village, it found an old man with a long white beard, sitting on the village bench, taking in the clean spring air. An old man with a long white beard that looked, well, he looked a little bit like a wizard. And that hat, it flew and it hovered above the old man's head. The old man who was in his own world and didn't notice the hat until he felt the tap on his head, and he was turned into a lizard. And before he could lisp and protest and say stop, well, that hat was off flying around the village looking for some more mischief, just as a door opened and out ran a young girl whose eyes were as blue as that May Day sky. The hat didn't wait. It sat on that little girl's head with her eyes as blue as the sky and turned her into a butterfly. And the little girl was actually quite pleased to be turned into a butterfly, but then suddenly there was a rumbling, and the clouds that had been so white and fluffy started to gather together, and they started to turn from white to grey. And there was a thundering, and then there was a flash. And just for a moment, on that May Day, the king of the fairies appeared, and he looked at the hat, and he shook his finger, and he said, "That's quite enough of that." And with that, the hat flew straight back to the king of the fairies. And just as quickly as he had appeared, he vanished into thin air. And as he did, the clouds grew white again, and the sun began to shine. And down below in the village, the little girl turned from butterfly back to herself. And the old man was no longer a lizard, but back looking more like that old wizened wizard. And the lady in the fields, she no longer buzzed, but she walked. And as for the boy who'd been sitting on the log, wondering why he'd been turned into a frog, well, he found himself once more. And so the day went on. But from that day to this, everybody in that village On the 1st of May, if the sky is blue and the sun is shining, they look up just to see if that magic fairy hat will appear again. But so far, it hasn't. And that is the story of that. So that's a little story that my fairies who live in my garden told me, but now I would like to welcome the wonderful Orla McGovern, who I think might have a little fairy story, or perhaps a little story of spring to celebrate this time of year for you. Over to you, Orla.
Thank you, Hannah. Oh, what a lovely story. That's gorgeous. Happy Law Bealtaine to everyone and Galway Theatre Festival. And thanks for having me. And I had to think about what story I wanted to tell. And it's definitely got some spring and a little bit of magic in there. And a little bit of Irish in there too. So if you recognise the Irish language words, great. And we'll tell it in English too. The great lady of the hedges was sitting on a branch, waiting for her love, the lord of the woods. She was going on a date, but he was always late. So to pass the time, she would reach up into the hedges and pluck the most beautiful berries from all around her. And as she picked, she glanced down, and she noticed down below were the people of the clay, but they were still and cold and not yet born. I will wake them, she said. So she reached up into the air and she plucked the most beautiful orange, golden Thrian Mara, a sea buckthorn berry. And she tossed it up into the air and she watched as it spun around. And this heat and this glow and this energy came out of the Thrian Mara, and the golden rays went down to the earth and woke up the people of clay below. And then they were born. Well, a whole year passed, and the great lady of the hedges, the Ban Vorna Volta, sat waiting for her love, Tiernan the Quilcha, the lord of the woods, but he was always late. So to pass the time, she sat and she plucked the beautiful berries from all around her in the hedges. And as she did, she glanced down and saw that the clay people were awake, but they looked tired and weary and just exhausted. So the great lady slipped down from her branch and walked among them. As she did, she came across first an old woman, very tired, churning butter with her hands. And all around her were huge mountains of butter. "How long have you been churning?" she asked the old woman. "Oh, just today," replied the old woman, exhausted. A little bit further down the road, the great lady came across a man with sweat on his brow, ploughing a field, and around him were hundreds of fields that were ploughed just the same. "How long have you been ploughing?" she asked the man. "Oh, just today," he answered. Well, a little bit further down the road, the great lady came across a woman walking hand in hand with her little child. Except her little child was a huge grown man with a big long beard, sucking his thumb. "When did you birth your baby?" she asked the woman. "Oh, just today," replied the woman. Ah, the great lady understood what must have happened. With the Dryan Mara forever in the sky, beating down its beams of light, there could be no time for rest. There could be no darkness. There could be no passage of time. So she called on her friend the spider and beckoned the spider over. Spin a web around this berry, she said, and reel it in under your body and hold it tight, and then there will be darkness. But half the time you must unfurl it down below so the people of clay can have warmth and light, and all will be well. The spider nodded, and the lady left. And a year passed, and the great lady of the hedges was sitting on a branch waiting for her love, the Lord of the Woods, who was always late. So to pass the time, she would pluck the lovely berries from the hedges, and she glanced down and she saw the people of clay below were for the most part happy with their bright and their dark, but there were a few people still complaining. A man walked up with a black eye. I got up in the middle of the night because our baby was crying, and I walked into a tree. It was so dark. A woman walked up with a bump on her nose. I just got up to have a drink of water, and I walked into a hedge, she said. And then another person came along, limping. I just had to go to the letters. I had to go for a pee, and I stubbed my toe on a rock. It was so dark. Ah, said the great lady of the hedges, I see. So the bright is too bright and the dark is too dark. She looked around, and up above her she saw the answer. She reached up and she pulled down a gorgeous poignant, a snowberry, and she tossed it up into the air. And as she did, a white light came from it. And then she plucked the Dryan Mara and the pouring Shnachta, and she began to juggle them up and down in her hand. And down below, the people of clay got an awful fright when they saw these lights dancing in front of them. But soon the lights found their rhythm, the warm light of the day and the cool light of the night. And just at the moment when the two were equal in the sky, who should appear? The great Lord of the Woods was here. Oh, and he was on time for the first time. The great lady was so excited to go on her date, she jumped off the branch, and as she did, the hedge shook, and out of it came hundreds and thousands of flowers, the barosh, the gurum, the blue borage flowers, beautiful star-shaped, and into the air they went. The great lady of the hedges hugged the Lord of the Woods, and above all was well. And you know what? Down below all was well too with the clay people, for that was the day that the light was born, the sun, the moon, and the stars. And that is my story for Lá Bealtaine for ye.
Oh, that was wonderful, Orla. I love that story. Thank you. And it reminds me of a story set in the woods, a story of a man, not the Lord of the Woods, unfortunately, just an ordinary man, one of those clay people. And he had been staring up at those beautiful stars that you described. And that evening, when he'd been staring up at those stars, he'd been thinking. Now, he wasn't an unhappy man, but he wasn't the happiest of men. And the reason he wasn't the happiest of men was because he didn't have much money. He worked hard, but unfortunately, there wasn't much work to be had. And so he spent most of his time in the woods, trying to gather fallen branches or anything to sell as kindling in the village. Now, he didn't live alone. He lived with his wife, and she, too, was mostly happy. But there was a sadness in her eyes, too. But her sadness wasn't because of the money. Her sadness was because she didn't have a little baby to call her own, to rock beneath those stars and sing the songs that her mother had sung to her. And she so wanted a little baby. But they didn't live alone in their little house on the edge of the woods. They also lived with the mother of the wife who had sung those songs to her daughter all those years ago. And she, for the most part, was happy that she could stay with her daughter and her son-in-law. But she too had a sadness in her eyes. And her sadness wasn't the money or the lack of grandchild, although she would have loved a grandchild. It was because those eyes that had seen those stars for so many years, were now failing her. They were now milky, and she could barely make out the stars or anything in the sky. And she knew that one day she would no longer be able to see those stars. And so each of the man, the woman, and the mother, they sat and they looked at the stars. And then when the morning came, the man, he decided he must go back into the woods and see if he could find some kindling to sell. And he put the thoughts of the night before, of the sadness of not having enough money, and the sadness of not being able to be a father, or to find a way that his mother-in-law would be able to see for the rest of her life. But he put that aside and he focused on going into the woods. And as he went into the woods that day, there seemed to be something different. He couldn't quite put his finger on it, but there was a buzz in the air. The wood, for it was early May, was blanketed in bluebells. And as he walked through the path in the woods, he swore he could hear the tiny tinkling of the sweetest sound of bells, almost as if the bluebells themselves were ringing. But he looked around to find what he could salvage to take to the village, when suddenly he heard the tiniest of voices, close to some fallen tree, to a log. "Help me! Help me! Help me!" And he looked at the fallen tree, he looked at the log, and "Did you speak to me? Help me! Help me! I am not the tree, but I am beneath this log. Please push it away so I may be free." Well, the man, he looked down, he got onto his knees and he looked more closely. The voice sounded as if it was a tiny bee, or perhaps some other type of insect, but of course bees don't talk, and there was that strange feeling in the woods that day, and he couldn't see anything. And he was just about to go on his way when the voice came again for a third time, and this time stronger still. Please, please help me. I am stuck under this tree. Just push the log and I'll be free. So the man bent down again, and he pushed with all his might against the log. And it was very, very heavy, for it was almost half a tree long. And as he pushed it with all of his strength, suddenly there was a flash of light. And there, as he fell back, was a tiny fairy, a tiny one of the wee folk. You have saved me, and in return I will grant you a wish, but only one. Now think carefully what your wish should be. Well, of course, the man immediately thought about the money. The money, that would be the best thing, wouldn't it? Because then he wouldn't have to work anymore, and he could feed everyone in the house. And it was as if the little fairy could read his thoughts, for she said, I know you may think of money, but believe me, there are greater wishes you could have. Think carefully. And with that, she was gone. And the man thought, should he wish for money? Oh, he didn't know. And then he remembered, whilst he might wish for money, what of his wife? She wished for a baby that they hadn't been blessed with. And then he thought of his mother-in-law with her failing sight. If she had had the wish, she would have wished for clear vision. How could he wish for his money and not talk to them first? So he gathered his thoughts, and he gathered what wood he could find, and he made his way back to the house. And there in the cottage he found his wife with her mother. And he said, something incredible has happened today. I have been granted a wish, but it's only one wish, and I don't know what to wish for. For if I wished for money, then I could build a fine house for all three of us, and we'd have plenty of food on our table, and never a worry would cross my mind again, I'm sure. But then I know that you, mother-in-law, you would not get to see our beautiful house. And I know how much you would wish for your eyes. And then his wife looked at him. And I know, my love, I know that more than anything in the world, you would love a child, and I would too. But we can barely feed ourselves. Well, this is a very tricky thing indeed. I need to make a clever wish, but I think it's beyond me. And then his mother-in-law. Well, if you will allow me to make the wish, I think there's a way we can have all three. And she whispered in her son-in-law's ear, that's a brilliant idea. And his wife smiled and said, well, my mother is very wise. Of course, course. Oh, I shall wish it right away. Now I wonder if you can guess what clever wish it was that his mother-in-law told him. Well, I'll tell you. He wished for a golden cradle with a baby inside that his mother-in-law might watch with clear blue eyes and sing to each night. And as that wish formed in his mind, as it hung upon his lips, there suddenly was a flash of bright light and a little laugh, just like the voice in the woods. And there between the man and his wife and the mother was a golden cradle and a beautiful baby girl inside. And the mother-in-law, she could see her grandchild, and she began to cry tears of joy as the husband and the wife cried too. But of course, a baby doesn't need a golden cradle. And, well, the man, he was very good with wood. And so he knocked up a lovely wooden cradle from the wood that he'd collected, and he took that golden cradle into town, and he sold that golden cradle, and with that money they lived happily ever after, singing beneath those stars. And that is the end of my second little story. But I think we've probably got time for just one more. Now, our first story was in the morning on May Day. And our second one was sort of later in the day, but I'm going to take you now to the evening after the celebrations of May Day. There had been a fine feast, a fine festival, where the fires had been lit and the songs had been sung. And one little girl had watched the flames dance and heard the songs and the stories from her grandmother and her parents and her friends. And she had gone to bed dreaming on that May night, her mind filled with all those wonderful stories and songs. But just as the clock was striking midnight, she was suddenly awoken from those glorious dreams by a tap, tap, tap on her window. Tap, tap, tap. And so, being a curious girl, she sat up from her bed and she got out and she went up to the window and she said, "Hello? Is anybody there?" And tap, tap, tap. So she drew back the curtains. And there, in the light of the beautiful May moon, was the strangest thing she'd ever seen. There was a bat hovering by her window, but it wasn't the bat that was the strange thing. It was what was on the back of the bat. It was a tiny little creature, a creature as dark as night, but with huge round eyes, as bright as the moon, and a mouth that was filled with starlight. Tap, 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 it went again with its tiny little finger. "Come and play! After all, it's May Day." Well, it was May Day, but still, it's time to play. It's the middle of the night. I'm not allowed to go out at the middle of the night. Oh, don't worry about that. I'll have you back in no time. Open the window and come with me. But how can I go with you? You can come on my bat. I'm too big for that. Nonsense, nonsense. Just open the window. Quick, quick, quick. Well, the girl was a curious girl, and her mind was still buzzing with all of those wonderful stories and songs, and she thought, oh, what if I could go on an adventure too? And so she opened the window. She put her head out. Before I come with you, tell me your name. Oh, I go by all sorts of names. You can call me this, or you could call me that. Or tonight, you could call me Fly-by-Night, if you like. Come on, come on. The night is nearly done, and we can't be out when there's sun. But I don't know how I'm going to get on your back. Just wait. And with that, the little creature turned the bat, looked behind him. Come on, just jump. You'll see. You'll be perfectly safe with me. Well, even though the girl knew that she probably shouldn't do what she was about to do, she was still full of all of those stories and songs, and so wanting to be part of her own adventure. And so she climbed onto the windowsill, which you must never try at home. She climbed onto the windowsill and she leapt. And as she leapt, she suddenly found herself on the back of the bat, holding on tight to the little creature, and they were off, soaring into the night, up and up and up, and oh, it was so exciting. And as she looked down, she could see her house so far below and the whole of the town. She could still see the embers of the May Day fires burning. But as they flew, she realized that they were flying higher and higher and further away from the town and her home. And now as she looked below, she realized that there were just fields and hills that she could make out in the starlight and the bright blue, huge moon. Please, I don't want to go too far from home. Can we stop now and go? It's been great fun, but it's really time for me to go back. Otherwise, my mother and father will be very worried. Oh, laughed the little creature. Nonsense, nonsense. We have got stars to chase, and why, we can go round the moon. That's much more fun than being in bed, surely. Come, let's go. Onward! And with that, they rose higher and higher, and the little girl was getting more and more worried, as for even the outlines of the hills and the trees and the fields below were beginning to disappear. No, please, please, no more. It was fun at first, but now I want to go home. Oh, really? You're no fun at all. I thought you would be the one to dance among the stars with me. Very well, very well. Back home we will go. And suddenly the little girl found herself having to hold on even tighter, for the strange creature on his bat was hurtling down towards the ground below. Not so fast, please, 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 we're going to crash. But the little creature, he just laughed. And then suddenly he drew the bat to a halt, hovering just above the ground. Here you go. You're back home, and I'm going to have to go to the stars on my own. The little girl, barely opening her eyes, slid off the bat. Oh, and was so pleased to feel the ground below her feet and her hands. And when she opened her eyes, she realised she wasn't back in the town at all. She was still somewhere, but where? This was just a field, and over there was just some woods, and oh, please, I don't know where I am, or how am I going to get home? Don't worry about that, said the fly-by-night, and with that, he was gone. You can imagine. Oh no, what am I going to do? I don't know where I am. I don't know how I'm going to get home. I just wish I'd stayed asleep, and I don't want to go. I don't want to be here anymore. I want to be at home. And she started to cry. And as she cried, her tears bounced on the grass below. And suddenly there was a tiny little voice. I would go to the woods if I were you. There's a path that I'm sure will lead you home. And when the girl looked down, all she could see was a stone. Oh, okay, that's a good idea. I'll go to the woods. There's bound to be something that I recognize. And even though she was scared, she summoned all of her bravery and she made her way across the field towards the woods. Now the moon was bright, and as she entered the woods, it was dappling the trees. And she was just about to step upon the path when she heard another sound. Oh, silly girl, did your mother never tell you to go with the fly-by-night, especially not on May Day night? Who said that? But all she could see in the bough of the tree was a spider spinning her web. Oh, okay, I've got to get home, and I don't know the way. But the stone said, take the path, and I don't like spiders laughing at me. And so she stepped upon the path and she went into the wood. And as she went through the wood, she thought that even the trees were giggling and tutting. I don't know. Fancy going with a fly-by-night on May Day night? Nah. Do you'll learn. You must stay safe, tucked up in bed. Oh, you're never going to get home now, are you? What are you going to do? Better just keep on walking. And so the girl did. In fact, she didn't walk. She was so scared now and desperate to get home that she ran as fast as she could until she came out the other side of the wood, and there was a huge lake. Oh, this isn't the way home. I've never been here before, and now that stone has led me to a lake, and I don't want to go back into the woods because they're just laughing at me. Just wish I was at home with my mum. And once again, her tears began to bounce. But this time they didn't bounce on the grass. Instead, they went into the waters of the lake below. And another voice came. But this wasn't an old voice or a mocking voice, a voice that was laughing at her. No, this was a gentle, soft voice. Now don't cry. I know that fly-by-night has been a very mischievous imp and brought you here, but I will bring you safely home. And as the girl dried her eyes and looked down into the lake, Along with her own face, she saw the moon. "Is that you, moon?" "Of course. I know how tricky that fly-by-night can be, and I will see you home safely. Trust in me. There, see the water lily. I will send it to you. Climb on board and let me guide you home." And sure enough, a huge green water lily floated to the side of the lake. And even though the girl was unsure, she so wanted to get home that she stepped upon that leaf, and it held her weight and became the most beautiful green boat. And she paddled with her hands in that lake, and the moon drew her on across the other side of the lake. And feeding the lake was a river, and down the river the little girl sailed in her water lily boat, the moon guiding her all the way, until finally she came towards the town that she knew. And on the riverbank, she left her little green boat, and she ran as fast could be, back to her house, back to her family. Now, some say when she told her story of that strange May Day night, that she'd probably been dreaming, and that there was no such thing as a fly-by-night. But the little girl knew that it had all been true. And from that day to this, on May Day night, she would wait and hope that a tap, tap, tap might come again. Because even though the fly-by-night had taken her on a somewhat scary journey, she had had the best story to tell for the rest of her life. But the tap never came, but the story lived on. She told it to her daughter, and her daughter told it to her own. And so, this May Day night, when you're tucked up in bed, full of wonderful dreams and beautiful songs, if you hear a tap, tap, tap on your window pane, just be careful, because it might be that fly-by-night again. And that is the end of my story. Our May stories for May Day. Thank you so much for sharing the stories with me. I hope you've enjoyed them. They're just a few of my favourite stories about this time of year. And I am so thankful to the Galway Theatre Festival for inviting me to share those stories with you, and for Orla for sharing her beautiful story as well. Thank you, everybody. I hope you have a wonderful rest of the day, a wonderful time at the Galway Theatre Festival, and maybe, fingers crossed, one day I can come and visit you in Galway. That would certainly be my wish for May Day. Bye, everybody.